Connor McDavid.
Connor McDavid.
Connor McDavid
is the best player on the planet.
At just 15 years old, Connor McDavid was already being called the best hockey player in the world who wasn't in the NHL yet. Picture this. While most teenagers were worried about exams, friends, or weekend plans, McDavid was under headlines that compared him to Wayne Gretzky. Scouts weren't just watching him, they were circling his name as the future of hockey. And he hadn't even finished high school. Did you know? McDavid was only the third player in OHL history to receive exceptional status, joining an exclusive club that included John Tavares and Aaron Ekblad. It wasn't just praise, it was an enormous responsibility.
So matching that speed is almost impossible. Well, it's completely impossible to do from behind.
Because once you're labeled the next one, every mistake looks bigger, every shift is judged harsher, and every success only raises the bar higher. By 16, he was tearing apart the Ontario Hockey League with the Erie Otters, and the media had already decided he was a once-in-a-generation talent. The world wasn't waiting for him to grow up. The world was demanding that he mature faster. So here's what pulls us in. How does a teenager handle that burden? How does a kid from Richmond Hill, Ontario, carry expectations so heavy that entire franchises were dreaming about him before he was even old enough to drive?
I'm Connor McDavid. I go to Premier Elite Athletics Collegiate.
This isn't just about hockey talent, it's about psychology, about what happens when childhood gets traded for responsibility, when the normal mistakes of growing up aren't allowed because the cameras are already rolling. Some kids collapse under that kind of spotlight, some rebel against it, some burn out before they ever make it to the pros. But McDavid, he didn't just survive it, he thrived in it, and that raises the mystery we're about to unpack. What made him different? Was it his natural mindset, the discipline drilled into him as a kid, or the sacrifices that most people never saw? Today, Connor McDavid stands as the captain of the Edmonton Oilers, recognized across the league as the best player alive.
I'm not sure. It wasn't pretty, but we got it done.
But the version of McDavid we see now, the calm, controlled, unshakable superstar, was forged years earlier in the uncomfortable space between childhood and adulthood. He didn't get the luxury of time. The transformation had to happen fast. And this is where our story truly begins. Not with the trophies, not with the records, and not with the fame. It begins with a teenager who had the hockey world in his hands long before he was ready to carry it.
Leon's got McDavid. Here is McDavid in alone. McDavid scores!
Because to understand McDavid today, we have to go back to those demanding teenage years. Back to the burden of impossible expectations, and back to the exact moment when Connor McDavid stopped being just a kid and started becoming something else entirely. By the time Connor McDavid was eligible for the NHL draft in 2015, the situation in Edmonton was desperate. The Oilers hadn't been a true contender since their dynasty years in the 1980s. Fans had been living on memories of Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier while the team slid through years of frustration. 2006 to 2015, Edmonton missed the playoffs 9 straight seasons, the longest drought in franchise history since their WHA days. Lottery picks piled up: Taylor Hall, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Nail Yakupov. But the pieces never came together. The Oilers weren't just losing games, they were losing hope. That's why when McDavid's draft year arrived, the city's attention locked onto him. He wasn't just another prospect, he was being called the chosen one. Analysts said he was the best player to enter the draft since Sidney Crosby. Scouts described his speed and vision as elite-level talent rarely seen. Some media outlets went further, putting him in the same sentence as Gretzky before he had even played a professional game. For Edmonton fans, the message was clear. McDavid was their savior. At 18, he wasn't joining a stable team where he could learn quietly in the background. He was being handed the keys to a broken franchise and told to fix it. And here's the twist. That kind of expectation is crushing. Studies in sports psychology show that labeling a young athlete as a savior creates an identity trap. Every action gets tied to that label. If they succeed, it's only what was expected. If they fail, the disappointment feels multiplied. For a teenager, that burden can feel impossible to escape. McDavid's draft night in June 2015 captured this perfectly. As soon as Edmonton won the draft lottery, fans flooded the streets cheering as if a championship had already been secured. His jersey sales skyrocketed before he even wore the number 97 in a game. The moment he walked onto the stage in Sunrise, Florida, it was clear. This wasn't just a first overall pick. This was the hope of a city falling on one teenager's shoulders. For many young players, that kind of spotlight leads to doubt, anxiety, even burnout. And history has plenty of examples where overwhelming expectations crushed talent before it could shine. So, how did Connor McDavid carry it? What made him step into Edmonton's storm without flinching when others might have broken? To answer that, we can't just look at draft night, because McDavid's ability to handle this challenge didn't begin in Edmonton. It started long before, back in Ontario, when he was still just a kid with a stick in his hands. To understand how Connor McDavid handled the expectations in Edmonton, we have to rewind back to a small town north of Toronto, Richmond Hill, Ontario. Here, before the cameras, before the headlines, Connor was just a kid who couldn't stay away from the ice. His parents, Brian and Kelly, noticed it almost immediately. By the time he was 3, he wasn't just playing with toys. He was skating. And not in the usual wobbly, slow way most toddlers learn. His balance, his stride, his hunger to keep going stood out. McDavid could skate backwards before most kids his age could even walk forward on ice. By age 4, Connor was already playing organized hockey against kids 2 and 3 years older. Local leagues quickly realized they didn't have a place for him in his own age group. He was simply too advanced. Coaches said he seemed to process the game differently, as if the rink was moving in slow motion for him. From the moment Connor McDavid laced up skates, it was clear he didn't belong in the usual age bracket. By 9 or 10 years old, the gap between him and other kids his age had stretched into something impossible to ignore. He wasn't just scoring goals, he was controlling games. Coaches, scouts, and even opposing parents talked about how he seemed like a professional trapped in a child's body. His vision, his speed, his ability to read plays 2 or 3 moves ahead. Those were tools players usually develop much later, if at all. But this kind of dominance came with a trade-off. To challenge him, organizers constantly had to move him up age groups. While most kids played against friends from school, Connor's teammates and opponents were often 2 or 3 years older. That meant bigger bodies, stronger opponents, and faster games. But he thrived in that environment. The sacrifices, though, were real. His schedule left little space for the normal parts of being a kid. Birthday parties, sleepovers, pickup games in the neighborhood, those didn't fit. Instead, his weekends were filled with tournaments in different cities. His closest bonds were with coaches, teammates, and his family, not with classmates. This level of focus is an early marker researchers often associate with gifted children. It's not just talent, it's maturity of attention. Where most 5-year-olds jump from one interest to another, Connor locked onto hockey and refused to let go. That kind of single-mindedness isn't typical, and it raised eyebrows early. But there's another side to being different. When a child outshines everyone, it creates distance. Opponents sometimes resented him. Other parents questioned whether it was fair for their kids to face him. And for Connor, there was no hiding. Every game was a spotlight, every performance became proof of his special label, or a challenge to it. By 10 years old, whispers were already circulating that he might be the best young prospect in Canada. That's an unusual thing to hear about someone who hadn't even reached middle school. By the time he was 14, McDavid's talent had become so undeniable that Hockey Canada made an unusual decision. He was granted exceptional status, allowing him to enter major junior hockey a year earlier than normal. Now Connor joined that elite group. At 15, instead of preparing for one last year of minor hockey, Connor was drafted by the Erie Otters of the Ontario Hockey League. Suddenly, the small-town prodigy was a teenager in a spotlight that stretched far beyond Richmond Hill. The move wasn't just about hockey. It was about growing up overnight. Erie, Pennsylvania became his new home, away from his family and childhood friends. He was a high school sophomore, living the life of a semi-professional athlete, surrounded by older teammates and playing against opponents who were stronger, faster, and often several years older. And with the move came intense scrutiny. From his very first OHL game, media outlets followed his every shift. Canadian newspapers, sports channels, even U.S. hockey writers were covering the 15-year-old. Words like "next Gretzky" and "game-changing talent" appeared in headlines. For most kids, a bad game means nothing more than a quiet car ride home. For Connor, it meant articles, debates, and comparisons. Researchers call this the spotlight effect, the belief that everyone is watching, analyzing, and judging you, even more than they actually are. For McDavid, it wasn't just a belief, it was reality. Every game was tracked, every stat published, every mistake magnified. This kind of attention could crush a teenager. But what stood out was how Connor handled it. Coaches in Erie often talked about his composure. He rarely showed frustration, rarely reacted emotionally. Instead, he processed everything like an adult. When teammates were distracted by the lifestyle of junior hockey, long bus rides, bigger crowds, new freedoms, Connor stayed locked on the game. Through it all, his play spoke louder than any headline. In his rookie season, he put up impressive numbers against much older competition. By his second and third years, he wasn't just a top player in the OHL. He was considered the best prospect in the world. The spotlight only grew brighter. The real question remains. How does someone carry that attention without breaking? That answer would become clearer in the years leading up to the NHL draft, when the expectations around McDavid reached a level almost no teenager had ever faced before. By 2015, the whispers around Connor McDavid had turned into a roar. Scouts weren't just impressed, they were unanimous. Every major analyst, from TSN to NHL Central Scouting, called him a game-changing prospect. That label isn't handed out lightly. It means you're not just the best prospect of the year, you're expected to reshape the entire league. The build-up to the draft became a spectacle. NHL arenas that had no chance of winning the draft lottery still sold tickets whenever Erie came to town, just to watch the teenager everyone was talking about. Every shift was dissected, every highlight was replayed on national television. And yet, the most striking thing wasn't just what he did on the ice. It was how he carried himself off it. In interviews, McDavid didn't sound like a teenager. There were no flashy quotes, no arrogance, no signs of being overwhelmed. Instead, he spoke in calm, measured tones, almost as if he'd been media trained for years. He answered difficult questions with the kind of maturity you'd expect from a seasoned pro, not someone still waiting to graduate high school. Experts often point out that composure under extreme attention comes from two things: preparation and identity. For McDavid, both were already in place. He had been living under a microscope since age 15. The constant interviews, the comparisons to legends, the feeling that the world was watching, none of it was new. The spotlight, in a way, had become normal, but that doesn't mean it was easy. Being labeled a franchise changer before you've played a single NHL game creates an invisible burden. One bad season could make headlines. One injury could change narratives. The draft hype wasn't just about potential, it was about expectation. And then came the lottery. When the Edmonton Oilers won the first overall pick, the hockey world immediately reacted. Some saw it as destiny. A struggling franchise in desperate need of revival, now handed the most hyped player in a decade. Others questioned whether it was too much for one. Could anyone, no matter how talented, really carry the hopes of a broken franchise on their shoulders? On draft day, when his name was finally called first overall, the moment felt less like a celebration and more like a coronation. The hype had delivered him to the NHL, but the real test was only beginning. Like this video if you're enjoying the story so far, and hit subscribe because we're just getting to the most intense part of McDavid's journey. Connor McDavid's NHL debut in October 2015 wasn't just another rookie stepping onto the ice. It was the beginning of a new era for Edmonton. The Oilers arena buzzed with energy that hadn't been felt in years. Every time he touched the puck, fans leaned forward, waiting for a glimpse of the magic they'd been promised. And at first, the promise looked very real. McDavid scored his first goal in just his third game. By November, he was producing highlight reel plays that made national broadcasts. Analysts kept repeating the same phrase: "This kid is as advertised." But then came November 3rd, 2015, a game against the Philadelphia Flyers. In the second period, McDavid was driving to the net when he collided with two defenders and went awkwardly into the boards. The impact was significant. He skated off, clutching his shoulder. Moments later, the diagnosis came: a broken left clavicle. Just like that, the dream start to his rookie season was over. McDavid's injury occurred in just his 13th NHL game, but he had already recorded 12 points and was on pace for over 70 points as a rookie. For someone barely out of his teens, the moment could have been devastating. Months of build-up, endless comparisons to Crosby and Gretzky, and now, after just 13 games, he was sidelined indefinitely. The headlines shifted overnight. Is he injury-prone? Can Edmonton really rely on him? Some media voices even suggested the hype train had been moving too fast. Behind the scenes, the challenge wasn't just physical. Recovering from a clavicle injury takes time, but the mental battle can be even harder. Suddenly, McDavid was forced to sit and watch a struggling team limp through games without him. The Oilers, desperate for a turnaround, once again found themselves near the bottom of the standings. And the player they had pinned their hopes on could do nothing but wait. Experts often talk about resilience as the ability to adapt and grow stronger through setbacks. For most people, that skill develops slowly, through years of trial and error. For McDavid, it had to happen immediately. At 18, he was dealing with something many veterans still struggle with: the burden of others' expectations during adversity. When McDavid finally returned in February 2016, the spotlight burned hotter than ever. Would he still be the same? Would the injury affect his confidence? The questions hung in the air as he took his first shifts back on the ice. And then, in his second game back, he answered. A spectacular end-to-end goal against the Columbus Blue Jackets reminded everyone exactly why he was called special. It wasn't just the speed or the hands. It was the confidence to take control immediately after months on the sidelines. The setback had tested him, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it revealed a deeper truth. McDavid wasn't just talented, he was resilient. But this was only the beginning of a much larger test. October 5th, 2016. The Edmonton Oilers called a press conference inside Rogers Place. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones stacked on the podium. When Connor McDavid walked out, he wasn't just another talented sophomore. He was about to become the youngest captain in NHL history. At only 19 years and 266 days, McDavid wore the C. He was 20 days younger than Gabriel Landeskog when Colorado named him captain, and younger than Sidney Crosby when Pittsburgh gave him the honor. From the outside, it looked like a moment of glory. For McDavid, it was another responsibility added to the shoulders of someone barely out of high school. Leadership wasn't optional anymore. It was his full-time job. Media duties, post-game press conferences, answering for wins, and, more often, losses. Every word he spoke became a headline. Every expression was analyzed. Teammates, some of them nearly twice his age, looked to him for direction. Picture the psychology of that for a moment. Someone still in their teens walking into a locker room with players in their late 20s and early 30s. Veterans who had played in the league for a decade and being expected to set the tone. It wasn't just about wearing a letter on his jersey. Being captain meant balancing two lives, Connor the young man and McDavid the public figure. While most 19-year-olds were figuring out college classes or part-time jobs, McDavid was tasked with leading a billion-dollar franchise. The stakes were enormous. Experts describe this situation as role strain.
Probably 12 years old when I first met Joe, and back then, two pieces of wood basically.
When someone is forced to take on responsibilities beyond their developmental stage, it can accelerate maturity, but it can also create hidden stress. For McDavid, it meant filtering emotions, always projecting calm, even when things were chaotic inside. He couldn't show frustration too openly. He couldn't admit doubt, because captains weren't supposed to. And yet, remarkably, he adapted. His natural demeanor, quiet, focused, intensely competitive, fit the role. He led not with fiery speeches, but with performance. In his first season as captain, McDavid put up 100 points, won the Hart Trophy as league MVP, and dragged the Oilers to their first playoff appearance in over a decade. Still, beneath the success was the unspoken truth. He wasn't given time to grow into leadership. He had to live it immediately. Every bad game, every tough question, every setback was magnified. The kid from Richmond Hill had officially become the face of a city. What happens when someone carries that burden year after year? The answer lies in understanding not just McDavid's talent, but his mind. When people describe Connor McDavid, words like speed, talent, and dominance come first. But those only explain what happens on the ice. The real story, the deeper story, lies in how his mind works. Because talent alone doesn't sustain greatness. Discipline, focus, and an almost ruthless perfectionism are what separate McDavid from every other next big thing who failed to live up to the hype. From a young age, his life was defined by structure. Wake up, skate, train, repeat. While most teenagers experimented with late nights, parties, and distractions, McDavid's world narrowed to a singular focus: hockey. His parents noticed early that he wasn't interested in the usual teenage milestones. No skipping practices, no hanging out until midnight, no casual, just for fun, sports. For Connor, it was always hockey, and always at full intensity. McDavid's typical day during junior hockey included morning workouts, afternoon practice, evening video review, and strict nutrition planning. A routine most professional athletes don't master until their 20s. This wasn't forced discipline, it came from within. Coaches recall him being the first one on the ice, the last one off. Even small drills became a test of precision. If he missed a pass or lost a puck, he would quietly repeat the sequence until he got it right. The sacrifices were obvious. He didn't have the normal social circle most teenagers rely on. There were no stories of high school parties, no relaxed summers on the lake. Instead, there was video review, strength training, and endless practice. To outsiders, it looked isolated. But to McDavid, it was a necessity. And this is where his psychology stands apart from so many other prodigies. History is full of young athletes hailed as the next Gretzky or the next Crosby who collapsed under overwhelming expectations. Some couldn't handle the media spotlight. Others burned out or simply lost the love of the game. McDavid avoided those traps because his discipline wasn't tied to hype. It was tied to identity. Hockey wasn't something he did. It was who he was. That doesn't mean it was easy. Living inside such a tight routine meant every mistake felt amplified. Missed opportunities, injuries, and even small lapses carried more impact because McDavid gave himself no margin for error. His mental toughness became both his greatest strength and his greatest challenge. Experts often point to what's called the spotlight effect, the feeling that every move is being watched and judged. For most athletes, it's a source of crippling anxiety. For McDavid, it became fuel. He didn't shy away from the idea that fans, teammates, and critics were watching. He internalized it, used it as motivation to perform at his highest level, game after game. That mental edge explains why he thrived when others faltered. Elite prospects before him often struggled with expectation, inconsistency, or loss of focus. McDavid turned expectation into structure. Attention became routine. Instead of shrinking under the burden, he built his identity around carrying it. But there's another side to this story, a quieter one, because perfectionism, while powerful, comes with hidden costs. The constant need to perform, the sacrifices of a normal life, the inability to ever switch off. Those demands don't disappear, they build. They accumulate over time. Even the strongest mind carries that load. And for McDavid, the ultimate test of that mental strength would come in the biggest moment of his career. Today, when Connor McDavid steps on the ice, there's no debate left about who the best player alive is. Night after night, he redefines what's possible, skating faster, thinking quicker, and producing numbers that look unreal in a league built around parity. Opponents study him, analysts run out of words, and fans in Edmonton cling to every shift. He's won multiple Hart trophies, Art Ross scoring titles, and has highlight reels that spread worldwide. But even with all these achievements, one piece was still missing until recently: the Stanley Cup Final. In 2024, McDavid finally led the Oilers to the Stanley Cup Final for the first time since 1990. Breaking through the franchise's long drought of championship contention. Though they fell short against Florida in a heartbreaking Game 7, McDavid's individual brilliance shone through as he won the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP, despite the loss. McDavid became the sixth player in NHL history to win the Conn Smythe Trophy while playing for the losing team, and the first skater since Reggie Leach with Philadelphia in 1976. That journey to the final represents something deeper than hockey achievement. It's about what it means when a child grows up too fast, when life's normal milestones are skipped for the pursuit of something extraordinary. At 18, he was a franchise savior. At 19, the youngest captain in NHL history. By his mid-20s, the global face of hockey. All of those achievements came at the cost of something simple: the chance to be ordinary. There were no lost weekends, no reckless teenage mistakes, no anonymity. Every move has been documented, every word dissected, every failure magnified. The boy who once skated circles around older kids has now spent more than a decade skating under the heaviest spotlight in sports. And yet McDavid hasn't cracked under it. That's the part most people overlook. His story isn't just about expectation, it's about resilience. The ability to maintain discipline when discipline feels like a prison. The ability to perform when performance is demanded, not requested. The ability to carry the hopes of a city, a league, and sometimes even an entire sport, and still walk out with composure. Experts often point to a paradox of greatness. The very traits that create legends, focus, perfectionism, sacrifice, are the same traits that take away the normal joys of life. McDavid is living proof. His dream became reality, but reality meant giving up the freedom of being just a kid. For him, greatness was never about choice. It was about inevitability. And that's why his legacy, Stanley Cup or not, already feels larger than statistics. Because he embodies the double-edged truth of elite sport. To become extraordinary, you must surrender the ordinary. To build a legend, you must bury the child who dreamed it. The chase continues. Another cup run awaits, and the missing championship crown still sits out there for a career that seems destined for immortality. But whether he wins it next season or takes several more attempts, Connor McDavid has already carved his place in hockey's history. Not just as a player who redefined speed and skill, but as a symbol of the cost that comes with being called the chosen one. And so we return to the question that began his journey. How did a kid from Ontario end up carrying the hopes of a city before turning 20? The answer is both beautiful and sobering. Connor McDavid is proof that childhood dreams can create legends, but legends are rarely allowed to be children. So if you enjoyed this deep look into the mind of a hockey prodigy, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story on the biggest NHL stars and their untold journeys. Which young player do you think will become the next Connor McDavid? Comment below. We want to hear your predictions.